morning. Welcome to Focus KSA. We're glad you've decided had the opportunity to join us today, as we're going to have a very interesting and informative conversation about the challenges in the Saudi labor issue. We're joined today by a very distinguished panel, and we'll introduce them shortly. I just wanted to bring you up to date on Focus KSA. We're an association between the Saudi-U.S. Trade Group, the sustg.org. For those of you who are getting the news review, you're very familiar with SUSTIG. For those of you who aren't, you should be subscribing to that. And Sustras.com. And I'm Patrick Ryan, Editor-in-Chief of Sustras, and we have Richard Wilson, President of the Saudi-U.S. Trade Group. This is our third of the Focus KSA series, where we bring you distinguished panelists to talk about the pressing issues in the Saudi-U.S. relationship and developments in Saudi Arabia. Today we're going to be talking about the transition in the Saudi labor force and the challenges to Saudi Arabian government and policymakers and business people, and how that is playing out in the current environment. I'm going to hand off to Richard Wilson, who's going to talk a little bit about the issue, and then we'll have our distinguished panel make some remarks, and we invite your questions. You can submit them either through your control panel or through email to me, patryan@sustras.com, and we'll get those in the queue for the open question and answer period. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Wilson, President of the Saudi-U.S. Trade Group.
Hey, Pat, thanks very much, and thanks, as ever, for sort of being the driving force behind this program. It's nice to have you in town. Amr, John, Nathan, wonderful. Thank you for joining us. We've got Amr in Dubai, John in Athens, and Nathan here in D.C. I'd like to just offer a brief context and an idea and a hope in terms of how you organize your thoughts. Our last session discussed the visit of President Obama to Saudi Arabia. It touched on some important geostrategic topics, obviously Iran, Syria, Egypt, and other neighborhood issues, Yemen, Iraq. These are critical issues that Saudi Arabia needs to get right. None probably as critical as other issues, one of which we're talking about today, and that's Saudi labor and transition. As we go through this, I'd like to ask your help, for me and for the listeners, to organize and maybe prioritize some of the key issues, and they involve the demographics, the bulging youth population. As we all know, close to 50% of Saudi Arabia's population is 25 or younger. Close to 30% are under 15. There's a transition in terms of the private sector labor market, in terms of nitakat and Saudization. The educational system is actively being addressed and needs to be refocused and reoriented to produce employable Saudi graduates. And this is not even addressing the issue of women. So as we go through this, I know each of you has expertise and ideas in different parts of this, but help us draw together, because this is a monumental task that Saudi Arabia needs to get right, and help us understand how they might approach it and what they must do to succeed. With that, Amr, if we can, you in your Dubai hotel room, if you can start us off. I know you are actively involved with all these issues, and I'll come back later because I want to hear a little bit about what Zahid Group and what you've been involved with in some of your lifetime initiatives that deal with youth, employment, and issues related to that. But please, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Patrick. And it's a pleasure to be here with Nathan and John. And I hope that at the end of this session, that the listeners or viewers would have something of value to take home. Obviously, internal capacity is the biggest challenge to every business and every employer, whether in the private sector, public sector, or the non-profit sector. finding skilled people with the right kind of attitude, with the right kind of abilities and knowledge is hard to come by. Additionally, there is the issue of whether these young Saudis want to work or not wanting to work. There are some who actually don't want to work. They're happy to just not work, and that is sad, because I believe that it's every Saudi's duty to work and contribute to the growth of our national economy and the prosperity for all. In order to really just go through the process, it all starts in schools. So you've got education that has to play a role in honing the skills and building the skills and attitude and discipline and code of ethics and shared values that are very important to any employee if they are going to succeed in the business environment. Secondly, you've got the whether the educational institutes miss out on that can be covered by the training institutes, and there are many. There are some that are private, some that are public, some that are domestic, some that are international. And then within the work environment, you need to have proper mentoring. A lot of the times, some businesses fail to look after young Saudi men and women and even persons with disability, and they just let them sort of throw them in the water and let them and see how they would swim without really proper guidance, without proper mentoring, and that is really needed in order for them to start building a career and a career path. And that will lead you to retention. People leave their jobs. The biggest reason for leaving one's job is because they can't get along with the manager, and that is it's a global problem. So just to summarize, because I don't want to take too much time, you've got to start with expectation of the job seeker in what he expects out of the employer and what the employer is providing, and these expectations have got to be realistic. If the employer provides the things I talked about in order to give the employee a happy working environment, then that will lead to job satisfaction, and job satisfaction leads to retention. I can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah.
I'm back. Pat, did you have a question for Amr? I think it's interesting. Amr being part of a very large conglomerate and involved in youth employment, that you focus on retention and employability. It makes sense. I think this is one of the key issues for Saudi Arabia is finding employable Saudis and retaining them. With that, John, I know you, John Sfakianakis, we're fortunate, provides regular columns to Saudi-U.S. Trade Group, and John does not pull any punches in terms of his analysis of the Saudi labor market. So I'm curious, John, to see what you're going to lead off with, because just in the last few months, you've written articles for us that deal with the labor reform, deal with nitakat, deal with training, all these things that you see could be done better in Saudi Arabia. How would you approach this?
Quite simply, the issue is not the issue of supply, it's mainly the issue of demand. And if the demand, which is the private sector, is fundamentally based on low wages low productivity, low skills, unfortunately, that creates a vicious circle. So, for instance, I fully agree that Saudi nationals cannot compete on levels of wages that prevail in sending countries in the subcontinent and other parts of Asia. In fact, if these were attractive, Saudis then would have emigrated themselves. So the issue is not just about wages, but overall conditions, the preparedness, skills, and motivations in order for Saudis to substitute workers. So at present, the jobs are aligned with low wages, low labor intensive, and labor intensive techniques. And this is not common in other high or even many middle income economies. So the answer lies in one, managing migration and letting wages reflect the citizens' skills and aspirations. This is one issue. Second issue is that if you look at since the 1980s, any regression analysis of all the Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia unfortunately has the lowest per capita income increase since 1980, despite high oil prices. And so that creates three kind of challenges. One is that the demographic window of opportunity is closing. Two, that's because people are aging and you have to capture them while they're young. And the government is trying, of course, to do its part. But you need the help and you need the debate with the private sector. You need to align yourself with the private sector. Two, as I said before, it's not so much an issue of demand, but also an issue of supply and what the private sector is willing to pay. Because if the private sector continues to pay low wages based on low skills, then the economy will continue to be attractive for those kind of people. So migration has to be controlled. And actually migration over the last 25, 30 years is driving the economy toward low productivity, although it is still profitable for the private sector to employ people due to low wages. So people are quite happy in the private sector. But this is not something that you can push forward, and you cannot create a viable, sustainable economy. And oil finally remains a dominant factor, but historically is a volatile sector and has created this kind of feeling that things are great. However, history shows that oil prices could very well change, and it is a cyclical business. So there are three questions that one has to keep in mind. One is the binding constraint for employing nationals. The issue is here, again, the labor demand, low value added, low wages, that has to change, and the labor supply. And the labor supply, Amr touched upon, and I fully agree, but if you don't have the right demand, the supply will not be there. So people will be sitting at home opting not to work for 5,000 riyals because they can earn 10,000 riyals. So they sit at home doing nothing. And so you have the incentives, which is nitakat, and I'll talk about this later. So the skills, attitude, and incentives right now are not there. The private sector is being pushed in order to comply. So what can the government do? The government can do many things. One is to begin to think in a holistic way about the labor market. So when you have a 5-year plan, you think how this 5-year plan can work to adjust itself on the labor side. Why? Because labor is, to me, the most important component of the future of Saudi Arabia, along with the issue of diversification. Because if you do not diversify, you can have a lot of people who could be in the future gainfully employed, but you don't have an economy. And then you need a time horizon. So to turn the economy into high value added, high productivity, high wages, more employment creation by the private sector, it has to be acceptable to citizens, and it has to be acceptable to the private sector. That's why you need a dialogue. But this is something that doesn't take 5 years or 10 years to adjust. This is a generational issue, and it will take a fairly long time to do. So what you need to address is the issue of capacity and willingness politically to ruffle some feathers, because obviously this is a huge adjustment on the private sector, and at the same time for the public sector to readjust itself by saying that we're not going to hire more people into the public sector because that gives people the wrong incentives. And in fact, since 2011, 43% of all Saudis who got employed in the economy were hired by the public sector. So even if there is willingness by the private sector, the public sector needs to do its part. And there you need to have political commitment and adjustment. I don't want to delve further. I can discuss the issue of Nitakat and its successes and also failures. But I want to pass the floor to you guys and then for Nathan to have a chance to say his part.
Well, let's do that. I think it's critical that we come back to Nitakat, and when you talk about the government willingness, this is clearly the strongest, most determined initiative of this sort that the government has pursued. There's maybe issues with that in your regard. Agreed. Let's give Nathan an opportunity to get out in the field and discuss where you think you see some priorities and some possible solutions.
Well, thanks, Richard and Pat, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion, and it's an honor to be on a panel with distinguished guests like John and Amr. My hypothesis is that it's useful to view the issue of Saudi labor reform as possibly 50% economics, but at least 50% politics, and it really needs to be understood in the context of the ongoing Arab Spring. And it fundamentally means, or should mean, to be effective, new jobs and new economic opportunities for normal, average Saudis. And I think one policy area that can be effective at doing that is creating and promoting new SMEs, or companies of up to 250 employees. It's been shown to be effective around the world at generating private sector driven growth, but just as important politically, in the context of the Arab Spring, it can be effective at creating new stakeholders in the system. But the key question in the Saudi context is what is an effective SME in the context of Saudi labor reform? Because it's not necessarily about profit, because the business model with Saudi investors and senior Saudi managers and 95% foreign labor can make a lot of money. But the real issue is, so it's about getting jobs for Saudis. And I think there's 4 features of a successful SME in the Saudi reform context. Number one, overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, hiring Saudi nationals. Most SMEs statistically are, I think, still at least 50% foreign nationals. A high quantity of new hires. Most SMEs in Saudi right now are 1 to 3 to 4 people, primarily maybe a Saudi owner and 3 foreign nationals. And there was there was a couple of articles yesterday about really cracking down on cover-up companies. So a lot of the SMEs in Saudi are not really generating jobs for Saudi nationals. Number 3, reasonably attractive and productive in employment that would attract the best and the brightest of Saudi. A lot of the younger Saudis like to work for the big, prestigious, and most stable employers like Aramco or SABIC or certain government ministries, or in the private sector, companies like Amr's. And number 4, profitability. But I think it's been very difficult until recently for a Saudi company to start and within a year or two to have 30, 40, 50 new Saudi hires and be profitable. And it comes down to follow up on what John has said, amongst several reasons, but one of the main reasons is, I think, the addiction to foreign labor. Just over the course of 3-4 decades, millions and millions of foreign nationals from countries with a cheaper standard of living than Saudi. And just to be clear, many of these foreign nationals were welcomed and played an essential and valuable role in the Saudi economy and were needed for a long period of Saudi history. But at the same time, it has had the effect of driving down market wages in many sectors, so that normal, average Saudis cannot find jobs in their own economy. And I'll take one example, which is trucking. In the 1960s and 1970s, many Saudis worked in trucking, but now it's dominated by migrant workers from the Indian subcontinent or the Horn of Africa, and market wages are $500 to $800 a month, which can support a family in Bangladesh or India, but is not likely to, it's not going to support a family in Saudi Arabia, and is not attracting jobs in Saudi interest. So I think the reform context of the last 2 to 3 years is correcting this situation, and I think as a benchmark should be a situation where a new SME can be founded, and within a year or two you could have 30, 40, 50 new Saudi hires and be profitable in some sectors. And I think government policy in the last couple of years is moving in this area, and that's Nitapat, for example, is limiting the presence of foreign workers, minimum wage of $800 a month, taxes on foreign labor, harsh penalties on illegal use of illegal workers. I think it's $26,000 now is the fine for using foreign workers who are illegal. The Human Resources Development Fund is another effective tool that I think is removing some of the incentive to hire undocumented or to hire foreign workers, and it also removes some of the risk for Saudi companies by paying half the salary for the first 2 or so years. But it's not just an issue of getting rid of foreign workers. There's other factors, and it's about improving the productivity of Saudi labor. But to shift gears for a minute or so, and which sectors of the new economy could new SMEs be effective at creating jobs for Saudis? And I would actually point to the blue-collar sectors of the Saudi economy: construction, maintenance, potentially manufacturing. And I know that is not what most people would say, but one interesting statistic is that the least successful sector in terms of Saudization is construction. And 6% of workers in the construction industry right now are Saudi. But if we flip that around, it also means that it's the sector of the economy where there's the most potential for large numbers of new Saudi jobs. The jobs are already there. There's clear demand for them. If overnight every single foreign accountant was replaced by a Saudi accountant, that would make a very small dent in the unemployment. But if you do that over 1, 2, 3, 4 years with construction, that could make a big dent. And there's a negative stereotype out there that says Saudis don't like working with their hands. And I think that's very simplistic and largely inaccurate. I think it comes down to the wages. Because if you look at the grandfathers and the great-grandfathers of the current younger Saudi generation, they worked with their hands. And the founders of many of the big, major Saudi private sector companies started out working with their hands. It's a question of status, financial status, and the social status that comes with it. And I spent several years working in Saudi, working with directly with Saudis in their 20s and 30s, and I never got the sense that they would not shift their interest if the conditions changed. And I would just draw attention to one important program to watch over the next couple of years, which is the Industrial Clusters Manufacturing Program. And there's a lot of details, and I won't go into it in detail. People can read about it on the internet. But Saudi has some very detailed and ambitious, well-funded programs to be competitive in 5 manufacturing sectors over the next decade. And if they are successful, if they are 50% successful, it's going to mean a more diversified economy with more jobs in manufacturing or the more blue-collar sectors of the economy. And it's something to look out for. And the key question, I think, is what would change interest amongst young, normal, average Saudis and get them more interested in working in these fields. Better pay, but I think if they felt like they were involved in something of importance to the kingdom that is tied to its future success, that would be a factor. And where you have their output tied to incentives, which does not usually happen in most parts of the public sector in Saudi Arabia. So in conclusion, I would just look at Germany and the US, where mechanics and construction workers and plumbers and factory workers can make very good wages. And just as importantly, those jobs have a certain status within their community. And there's no reason that can't happen in Saudi Arabia. And I think something like that needs to happen in order to really bring about long-term reform of the labor market.
Terrific. Thank you, Nathan. We appreciate those comments. We're going to give our panelists just a time for a brief commentary on what's been said. But first, let me remind everyone that this is FocusKSA, a joint effort of the Saudi-U.S. Trade Group and the Susers.com website. You can get detailed biographies of our guest panelists by going to susers.com/FocusKSA. And we'll get to questions from our audience, and we have some very good ones lined up. But Amr, maybe you can lead the three of you commenting on what's been said, and then we'll get to questions.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I mean, I would like to agree with Nathan that really SMEs are the way to go forward in order to create job opportunities for young Saudis. Saudi Arabia today, SMEs really rank at the very bottom of the list in the world in creating jobs and hiring Saudis. One of the key issues there is that there is no rule of law to protect a young Saudi entrepreneur from hiring other Saudis, training them, getting them to learn the business, and then they go and open next door and compete directly against them. So that is one of the reasons that Saudis are discouraged from hiring other Saudis. So that is one issue. The other issue is with regard to the blue collar. I agree with you. At Zahid Group, we have a 3-year apprentice program for blue collar workers, and we do train them. And I agree with you. The retention is much higher than white collar workers. We have factories that joint venture with foreign companies for lubricant oil. We have other factories that assemble trucks, and the percentage of Saudis there is upward of 60 and 70%. So it is definitely they like to work with their hands, and if they are trained properly. But it takes 3 years to really graduate them with a guaranteed job at the end of the day. So I agree with you that blue collar is definitely one area. When it comes to the issue of wages, I'd like to just make a comment that there is a mismatch, or let's call it a dysfunctional system here, whereby if you are a contractor and you're bidding for a job, you've got to win that job based on price, but you're not given any weighting system in if you hire Saudis. So when it's you kind of are caught between a rock and a hard place. Do I hire Saudis? If I hire Saudis, I won't be able to afford to be competitive and win the bid. And at the same time, the person who's giving that contract is funding the training of Saudis and so forth. So I think there is if we can manage our funds as a nation in a better and more efficient way, so we would encourage contractors and construction companies to hire more Saudis and not penalize them by awarding contracts to people who are hiring third country nationals at half the prices. So that's one issue. One other point I wanted to kind of comment on with regards to what John was saying. I agree with him. It is an issue of supply and demand, and matching the two together is always a challenge. But the only thing I would like to add to what he said is that Saudi Arabia is not a homogeneous country when it comes to Saudi labor. They're very different from one city to another, from one town to another, from one village to another. If you go to Yambo, for example, or Jubail, where there are the Royal Commission industrial cities that are based on petrochemicals, or the new ones now like Wa'ad al-Shimal, the Promise of the North, you would find that Saudis are willing to work and willing to work for less wages, and I think that we can increase the employment in those regions more significantly than we would in the big cities of Riyadh, Jeddah, or Dammam. So I think that is a very important aspect. Also, these new places, new areas where there are new industrial cities, like the four industrial economic cities, like King Abdullah Economic City and so forth, I am seeing already, and we are investing heavily in King Abdullah Economic City. I'm seeing more and more Saudis are interested there, but the biggest challenge is the mobility. The Saudi people are home-driven, family-driven. They don't like to travel very far from their families, and that presents a major challenge. So we're trying to attract them by creating more of a family environment for them in these cities. So that is where the biggest challenge is.
Great, thanks, Amr. John, you want to make some brief comments?
Yeah, let me say a few things. First of all, about SMEs. So it's very nice everybody talks about SMEs, so that's the future of Saudi Arabia, undeniably. Like most other modern economies, countries such as Japan has 60% of its value added coming out from SME activities. But in Saudi Arabia, it's not going anywhere. And it's not going to go anywhere until the following steps are taken. Number one, there has to be access to finance. Right now, SME borrowing from the banking system is about 3%. The bulk of borrowing happens to large enterprises like Zahid, right? And until that relationship changes, primarily from the banks, not necessarily from the private sector, this is the responsibility of the banks, the SMEs are not going to be financed. So there is a problem. We can keep on talking about the future of SMEs in Saudi Arabia, but if there is no access to financing, that creates a huge amount of problem. Number two, there is a lengthy bureaucratic process that completely destroys the core of SMEs. Procedures, licensing is a big problem. And for instance, basic accounting is not known by a lot of the SMEs. So educating the SMEs at the level of high schools is very important. Also, the structure of these SMEs has to be redone, because right now it is based on single proprietorship companies. So that creates all kinds of delegation problems, because daily operations are undertaken by expatriate managers, and that limits innovation and the acquisition of skills amongst SME Saudis, or potential employers or employees Saudis. So this has to change, and in order to go from low margin activities that have very little effort to high margin activities, innovation has to be there, and it's very important to change this vicious cycle of things.